Is the global consumer really still the most important driver of the global economy? I'm Bart van Ark, and welcome to our quarterly panel on global consumer confidence at the Conference Board. Hello and good morning from New York, good afternoon from Brussels. My name is Bart van Ark and welcome to our quarterly review of global consumer confidence. A great group of people and a great agenda today that we're going to discuss. First of all, of course, talk about the global and regional results that were just released for the fourth quarter of 2019. What does it actually mean for the economy going ahead? What are the important drivers of confidence? We'll be talking about the job prospects, personal finance, spending optimism, and how consumers are actually responding to all of those. We're going to take a little bit more of a deep dive in what are the biggest economic and personal and social concerns that consumers have identified in quarter four. And then finally, how are consumers actually thinking about their spending behavior and their spending patterns? So we got a lot to talk about. For that, we've got a fantastic panel again today. On the right of me, on the left of you, is John Forsyth. He's our institute leader in our Consumer Dynamics Institute, very much involved with all the work that we're doing around the consumer at the Conference Board. Welcome.
Thank you.
And then on the far left of you is Steve Opland, President and CEO of the Conference Board, a former career in retail, and therefore somebody who really can look at this from a retail and of a CEO perspective. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Bart.
And then we've got two of my greatest colleagues online. First of all, from Brussels is Ilaria Maselli. She's our senior economist for Europe, and she will, of course, talk about the survey as a whole, but certainly also the implications for the European economy. Welcome, Ilaria.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here
again.
And
then finally, we've got Elizabeth Crowfoot. Elizabeth is a senior economist on labor markets, a very important part of the Consumer Confidence Index, and she's been driving a lot of the analysis for this report. Great to have you on, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Bart. Good morning, everyone.
And then there's one more thing I have to do before we can get into the detail, and that is that I know that some of you are joining us for CPE credits. If that's the case, then please don't forget that if there's a box popping up, to type your full name and email address in the space that's provided. Click OK, free pop-ups during the program, stay online for the entire webcast, and obviously you can only get these credits if you're live in the webcast. And with that, I actually want to go right into the content because we have so much to cover. So John, I'd like to start with you and just take us quickly through again, why does that consumer confidence number actually matter? Why do we need to take a look at that?
Yeah, why are we even here today? Yeah, right.
Right. Always a good question.
That's a couple of things that I would say. One is domestic demand and consumer spending makes up over half of the economies in many, many countries, right? And so it's a very, very important part of the economy. Second is, we'd love to understand the mood of the consumer and what they're thinking right now and how they think about their situation in the future. So, when we actually go out and look at the survey, we find out how their sentiments are doing now, but we also talk about how they see the future and how that might affect them too. And lastly, we do ask about how this might change some of their economic and some of their behaviors. And so, it's all claimed, right? But it does give us a sense on how they're thinking and how they're adjusting to their current economic situation and personal situation in the future. And by the way, we have done some analysis, which I think we're going to share, in a couple months or so?
Right.
That actually looks at these sentiments that we're going to talk about today are very, very related to actually core economic measures. So these are the right things to be looking at.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about these core economic measures in a minute, but certainly more research to be done. Just very briefly, what is the actual methodology behind the survey, just so that people know how we do this?
So we do an online survey. It's important to remember that this is an online population reflective of these countries, right? It's core to them. We do this quarterly with Nielsen. We talk to 32,000 consumers in 64 countries. It's 500 per country. In China, we actually do a deeper dive given the importance of that country. And the three questions that we ask about, the job prospects that they see over the next 12 months, their own personal finances over the next 12 months, but then is currently a good time for them to be buying these needed and wanted goods and services. These are all, we ask other topics, but these are the core ones that go into the confidence index.
Yeah, and I should perhaps say that today we talk a lot about sort of the big picture, the economic picture, how does the consumer behave. Our colleagues in the Marketing, Communication and Consumer Dynamics Institute and Center, they will actually look much more at some of these questions from what does it actually mean for consumer spending and so on. So there will be more coming up later this quarter from our colleagues over there. But let's go straight into some of the headline results. Let me, by the way, encourage all of you to put in your questions. You heard that during the opening. There is the chat box. Put in your questions anytime, and we'll try to weave them on during the conversation. So Elizabeth, take us through some of the headline results, and then we'll talk a little bit about what that means from a very high level for the economy.
Sure. Like Bart mentioned, these are the high level or top line numbers for the Global Consumer Confidence Index. And what we see here is that the global index was unchanged at 107 in the fourth quarter of 2019. And this really represents a stabilization of the index. And it has remained at this level for the past year or so. It is a record high. So it also it signifies that consumers are more optimistic than pessimistic. But what's interesting here is to look at the regional differences across these 6 different areas that we're highlighting here. So in terms of the levels, we do see more optimistic consumers in North America and in Asia Pacific, relatively more pessimistic consumers in Europe and Latin America. Those values are below 100. And for the most part right now, Africa and the Middle East is about in neutral territory. It's right at 100, but that does represent an increase from a more pessimistic standpoint. And that's a good segue into focusing on the trends, which I think is the most interesting part of this data set, to really look at how confidence has been changing over time. So we see that there are some increases in North America and in the Middle East. And we have decreasing confidence in Europe. And in some of the other areas, including Euro area, the Asia, Pacific, and Latin America, it has been more or less stable. And I think what is really interesting throughout our conversations from past results as well, is that the consumer has been identified as the engine of economic growth, not only here in the U.S., but also in many markets worldwide. And it's this lack of momentum that we're seeing with the stabilization of the index that really raises questions about whether the consumer can continue to prop up the global economy in 2020. So it's something that is definitely going to bear watching as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think, you're absolutely right that the underlying regional detail, and we'll talk a little bit more later about countries even, is more important actually than the aggregate number. And I think the most striking thing is actually this slight weakening in Asia Pacific, because that's something new. That's not something we have seen over the past couple of quarters. And we need to dive a little bit more deeply where that slowdown is coming from. We have our famous heat map, which shows you where the most optimistic and pessimistic consumers are. You want to say a few things about that?
Yes, and just to give our listeners an idea of what we're looking at here. So this heat map is showing the levels of the index. So more brown countries are representing more optimistic levels. So those are values over 100, and consumers in those areas indicate that the 3 drivers that John was describing before about job prospects, finances, and spending intentions are more good and excellent. And the markets that are more blue represent more pessimistic levels, so values less than 100, and their consumers indicate that these drivers of confidence are either not so good or bad, or more not so good, more negative. And we do have 64 different countries here, so there's some interesting variations to dig into.
Yeah, and as you said a little earlier, it's really the trend that is important, perhaps more than the actual levels. We'll talk a little bit about the levels during our discussion. But in this slide, you're actually showing the change quarter over quarter. So this is another type of heat map, slightly different colors, but maybe you can explain what the big differences are.
Right. So again, in terms of the heat map, we have more green and showing larger increases in confidence, and the countries that are more red are showing larger decreases in consumer confidence. And what we're seeing is that nearly half of the markets saw a decline, and it is an improvement from what we saw in the previous quarter. But that improvement, but actually so the weakening has been happening in some of the larger economies, such as China, Germany, and Japan, and Mexico, which we note here on the slide. And what's interesting to me is that these are some of the markets that are relatively more dependent on exports. And even though we've seen that the consumer has been very resilient to trade and geopolitical tensions, it might be starting to indicate that it's bleeding into this consumer sentiment about how these factors are going to be affecting their spending.
Yeah, so let's hold that point for a second, right? Because this trade issue and how that may be playing into export markets might really be an important factor. So we'll come back to that in a second. Now, there's one more slide I wanted you to show, which was recession risk. It's not here right now. Maybe it's a little further down. Let's take the one later on recession risk. Let's go straight to the audience poll question. Because before we go into the discussion with our colleagues, we'd like to hear from you all what you think about your opinion about the following statement. Consumer spending will be the most decisive factor determining whether the global economy can see a growth recovery in 2020. So consumer spending will be the most decisive factor determining whether the global economy can see a growth recovery in 2020. And your line is open, and some of you already started voting. And after that, we go straight into a discussion of those results and the analysis that Elizabeth has just provided us. So we gave it sort of 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're closing this. Okay, so 2/3 of you actually say somewhat agree with that statement. Not strongly agree, somewhat agree. A very small number actually with strongly agree. Most of them somewhat agree. Steve, let me start with you. Are you surprised about it? Would you have said strongly agree, and how do you think about what Elizabeth was talking about?
No, I think this is aligns very well with actually what happens. You know, I think John started by saying that across the globe, majority of a country's economic strength is driven by the consumer, and that's even more so here in North America and especially in the U.S., where I think sometimes you see upwards to almost 75% of the GDP change driven by the consumer. And of course, that's where I spent my career. We looked at this almost daily, and it's interesting when you are running a retail business, as I did. You could see store by store, hour by hour, how the changes happen. You could watch headlines hit, or disasters hit, or whether it's a weather or an outbreak in SARS or something, and you can watch the consumer real time. So the consumer does have a huge impact on the economy. They are influenced by a lot of things. But I think over the course of a quarter or a longer period of time, it does tend to be confidence in their situation, which is driven by jobs and spending. So now you come back and you say, okay, well, why are these changes? I love these heat maps because it's interesting to see. But you cannot escape geopolitics. So some of the biggest drivers, for instance, in Latin America are Mexico and Chile, where you see some big changes in their geopolitical situation, the political environment or the security of the country and so forth. Same thing, too, in Asia. So I think that you see those impacts and it goes. The final thing I'll say is, of course, this isn't to talk about the CEO confidence, but we do have a global CEO confidence. That index has been coming down for a very large period of time, impacted by the trade situation, and we saw actually a bump up. The consumer piece of it has been totally independent of what's been happening in the trade. They've been spending like crazy, and things have been going very well there. So it's interesting now to see a little bit more of a convergence.
So let me probe you a little bit on this trade thing. I saw you speaking on CNBC last week, also talking about these results, and you were asked about the difference between the US and China. So the US actually, we see the numbers up a little bit. In China, we actually see it down. Do you really think that that is basically driven by this trade dispute and that Chinese consumers are just much more concerned about it than US consumers?
Well, I do, because the Chinese consumers work in these factories that produce goods that ship to the US, whereas we're not making stuff in the US to ship as much to China. It's more agricultural. So if you went by sector, you would see the farmers in the US affected more by the trade deal. But the consumers, who are the factory workers and generally throughout China, more impacted by the deal as it relates to China itself. So you do see differences between the countries in how the consumers interact with the countries and the countries interact with themselves.
John, from a consumer insight perspective, when you look at these results, is the consumer in sort of healthy shape, or are you getting a bit more concerned about the health of the consumer as a spender and a driver of the economy?
Yeah, we've seen over the past couple of quarters that we've stayed at record highs with the overall global index, and in some sense that's great news, right? It's record high, things are going really well. Okay, it's not going up, but it's not going down, and we continue to see it not going down. And you see the number of countries where it's going down hasn't really changed from last quarter. However, right, so you could take a positive view of that. However, I think there are some signs that it's not quite as strong as what we've seen in the last couple of quarters. And I think I go to, as Elizabeth was just saying, that some of the largest economies, right, you take China, as Steve was just saying, you start to see some softening there. You see Japan, some softening. Germany, you see some softening. And I think that raises a few more alarms than what we saw last quarter when we all got together and talked about this.
Right. So there's still some cause we need to watch it very closely.
Absolutely.
And see where they're heading this. Ilaria, let me go back to you and ask you and let you comment on what's just been said, but also want to ask you about this question about the European consumer. You talk about countries in a minute a little more, but the European consumer seems to be a little bit different than consumers in Asia and consumers in North America, and I need to understand why that is.
Well, if I answer that question in a number, it's because consumer confidence is about 20 points lower than in Europe than it is in Asia, and even more compared to the US. If we just compare the numbers, but I don't think that's entirely correct. We should look at trends, as Elizabeth was saying 2 minutes ago. So to your question, but yes, there is some sort of pessimism on average, because consumer confidence in Europe is well below 100, so there is more pessimistic consumers than optimistic ones. Right now, even though we have to say that we are very high in historical levels. So a little bit like in the global numbers, we really see consumer confidence still very high here. But I agree with John that even here we start to see some signs. And one sign, and I want to go back to what Steve was saying about China and the US, one sign I would say is the fact that consumer confidence went down in Germany. And of course, we always look at the German data because that's the engine of the European economy. It's the largest country, the largest GDP in Europe, and we saw really this quarter consumer confidence going down. And really, the question there is whether the overall pessimism among businesses. Because business confidence has been going down in 2018 and 2019 quite a lot, whether this pessimism is passing from business to consumers, which would be basically the biggest risk for the European economy.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that your German comment is really important, because again, it's one of those nations that is heavily dependent on manufacturing, and even though they were not in the middle of the China-US trade dispute, in a way they were in the middle of it, because China's Germany's dependence on the Chinese economy is actually pretty critical. So it seems that in Germany the narrative has really moved from businesses being concerned to consumers also being concerned.
Yeah, but you have to point out in Germany their dependence on the automobile sector. And there are and this is a sector issue in Germany, where you have the Dieselgate issue, which has whacked the earnings of VW, which of course is owned a large part by the states. And then we saw Mercedes Daimler-Benz drop by about half in profitability. So their profit sharing is getting hit, their bonuses are getting hit, and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff. When they brought a lot of that, you could say, onto themselves by some of the behavior. But I just want to back up. So, we Americans are famous for being glass half full. And I just want to take that view. If you said to anybody, define the epitome, the perfect global consumer confidence index, what would it be? What would nirvana look like? Well, economists don't want things to be overheated, because then of course you have hyperinflation and that sort of thing. So you want things to be growing but stable.
Steady.
You want inflation to be up 2%, but 1.5 to 2.5, somewhere in there. You want trade to be on a good footing. You want, of course, no tariffs. You want open trade. But here, so if you go down and tick the boxes on every list, you get about as close to nirvana as is really practical in the world today. Yeah, there are some geopolitical, yeah, there are some industry situations, but we're sitting here at near an all-time high. We've been sitting there for 2 consecutive quarters, in the face of trade disagreements, which now are seeming to be stabilized. Inflation seems to be under control. So, this might be as good as it gets.
Well, but that's actually then the question. It's actually even more than 2 quarters that we've been at this very high level. So isn't there, we know that, it's, recessions don't die because of old age, but
Right.
but what is bringing this to an end? I think there is a kind of unease that this cannot continue forever.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, what's going to happen, and you brought this point up, and I thought it was brilliant, which is now that the U.S. and the Chinese situation seems to have stabilized, USMCA is under control, huge trading blocks, right? You got to look at Europe and what happens there. You got to look at what happens to Brexit. Do they turn to North America? Do they craft agreements, on the basic trading operations with Europe, and what happens with the automobile and the airline sectors there? What happens to the banks and liquidity, through this thing? So what is the thing that's going to be the catalyst? And I think that's what economists and everybody else looks for. There's nothing on the horizon, though, that says that it should derail this in 2020.
Ilaria?
So no, I like the comment of Steve on the nirvana, and it's true that we're actually not too far from the nirvana, but I think there is one thing missing, and that's the fact that you want to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today to be really in full nirvana scenario, and that's the problem right now, because we see in some questions in the survey that the mood of people is changing, and I'm thinking of 2 variables, two pieces of data that I saw in the numbers there. One is the fact that people are more concerned about their jobs. And if I look at Europe, it is actually true that job creation is slowing. So job creation until last couple of quarters was growing year on year on 1.5%. And right now, we are in the nirvana of the labor market because there are 10 million more people employed today than before the global financial crisis in 2008. So labor market looks good, but job creation is low, and it's now 1%.
Yeah, so that's a good transition actually to the next section, because we're going to talk a little bit about these underlying index. I mean, my view on this is I buy it, that consumers are sort of hearing all this chatter on trade and disputes and so on in the media, and at some point they think, oh, we don't feel great about this, but frankly, I think they're only really going to get concerned when they have to think this is going to take my job, right? I mean, we're going to get layoffs. And frankly, we don't see in China, to your point, Steve, we have seen layoffs in manufacturing, so I can see why there's concern there. But I think we really need to focus now on, do people still believe that they'll have a job in a couple of months' time? If that's not the case, we have a concern. So this is a good transition, Ilaria, to this slide. This is the most complex slide in our presentation today. So take us through this carefully, because it really drives the 3 underlying indexes here that are underlying the consumer confidence index. What are we looking at in this slide?
Yeah, first of all, I want to know if I get some special bonus if I explain this correctly, because it's fairly complicated, but give me a couple of minutes. So these are the 3 components of the index. So we calculate the overall index, the 107 or whatever number it is in each country, based on these 3 sub-questions. So what do you see your job prospect in the next 12 months, your personal finances in the next 12 months, and what are your spending intentions right now? So these are the 3 components. And what you can see here in the slide, this is for the global consumer, is a balance for each of the items, because as we were saying, it's important to look at the underlying components to really understand where this is going. So let me start with the 0. So when you see the little triangle there at 0, it means that there are as many positive views as negative views on that component in that country, in that economy. And what you can see is that this is in green territory. So overall, the balance is positive on each one of the 3 sub-indicators. And then what you see in the small parentheses in the triangle is the change compared to last quarter, so compared to quarter 3. So there are a couple of important messages out there in these numbers. One is that all in all, we have still more positive views on job prospects, personal finances, and spending intentions in the global consumer than negative ones. But all of these three components have actually a small minus attached. So it's not big enough to actually move the index, but there is something that is moving in the negative direction.
Yeah, and then if we go to the next one, we breaking it down. It is clear. It's clear to me. I hope it's clear to the audience. But if we go to the next one, we actually are now looking at this from a region by region basis, and then you see, going back to Elizabeth's earlier point, there's quite a bit of variation between those components and between regions.
Yes. So these are the same number as in the triangle of the previous slide, but then for each region. I'm not going to comment on the region because I know we're going to do that in a moment. So I was looking at this chart, looking at the verticals. And what is interesting is that if you look at the balance of personal finances, so you go to the third column there, you can see that the red is dominant. So the negative views, either in terms of levels or in terms of changes, are actually more red than green. And that's the first message there. And that's interesting, I think, because we were saying that last quarter we were looking at the same column, and we were saying, okay, the world from the consumer point of view actually looks really good because there is wage growth, there is economic growth, not fantastic. I mean, it's lower than in the past, but still we don't see a recession risk. There is overall low inflation in many countries, so the purchasing power of people has increased. So all in all, the personal finance situation looked actually quite good, but there is something in the perception of people that is changing, driving a large number of red, small arrows pointing down there in the personal finance column. Then there is the job prospect, which is the second one, where there are more red arrows pointing down than positive one. And as I said, it's because job creation is slowing down. Now, I think that's a little bit inevitable because labor markets are getting really tight. I mean, already in Europe, which is not where the unemployment rate is the lowest around the world, we're still at around 7%, but already here you can see that job creation is inevitably slowing. And then we have countries like the US where it's difficult to imagine that the unemployment rate goes further down. So labor markets are getting tight, business cycle is getting mature. So people are perceiving that there are not as many opportunities in the labor market as before, and this is probably driving their expectation on the.
And that really suggests to the earlier point that we had, that is, that the job prospects is the thing to watch. But I also find a sort of interesting chain here, right? Because the way to think about it is job prospects is the first thing you start to worry about as a consumer. Then you think, okay, that's going to happen to me. What does that mean for my income? Even more reds here. So you see that transition already made. And then you see, if you're in the same, you say, well, this is not the time to spend or the right time to spend. And there we still have a mixed picture. Some areas you see more concern in Europe, in Asia Pacific, but some other parts of the region are still up. Steve, is that a good way to think about the change? Job prospects, income, spending.
Yeah, but I've seen this many times before, where you're sitting at a pinnacle. Think about it as you climb the mountain, you have all this anticipation, you get to the top, you snap a few selfies, and now there's no place to go but down, right? So, this is the problem. And then when you're sitting in good times like this, it's, well, how long can it last? Well, it's got to go down from here. How much more can it go? Because we have virtually full employment, but we've been saying we've been at full employment at 5, at 4, at 3, at least, in the developed countries. So I think the point is, it doesn't die of old age. There has to be a catalyst. As long as wages are growing, job prospects look good, I think the consumer will keep going. As long as that happens, it should be fine. You have to watch for the geopolitical events, elections being one of them.
Right. Elizabeth, let me go to you. Take us through some of the regions, and you may want to talk particularly a bit about the emerging markets. I'm interested in Latin America and Asia Pacific. I'll go back to Ilaria in a minute, of course, on the euro area, and then we'll talk a bit about the US also. Please.
Sure, and just to go back on some of those issues with the job market, I mean, from a labor market standpoint, that's definitely where my focus has been. And with Asia Pacific, we see that consumers are really starting to worry about these job prospects, even though we see that some of these more traditionally export-dependent Asian countries, we're talking about China and Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, these are countries that were very ingrained in global supply chains. And now that manufacturers are moving away from China and into some of these other opportunities, you would think that some of these consumers actually have some rising job prospects. But another thing to keep in mind is sort of the skill factor, right? Because a lot of this manufacturing that's moving into these other countries is much more advanced. And so there's sort of a skill gap, especially in Vietnam, for example, where maybe these consumers aren't seeing those opportunities that were otherwise would be there in, for example, a tight labor market where in theory there would be plenty of jobs to go around. So I think that's an interesting aspect of Asia Pacific. And in terms of the Latin America, I mean, we're really talking about political instability being the driving factor in that region. There's a lot of government elections that have been very contentious, that are impacting consumers, their views about their jobs and their spending and finances. In Mexico, also, we have a stagnating economy coupled with the slowing U.S. economy doesn't really bode well for some of for consumers, even though they're seeing record high remittances levels and minimum wage increases. So we do see that there are some government policies also that are trying to prop up these consumers in Latin America, but just whether those are going to take effect. Again, to Steve's point, it really matters that political election environment and how that's driving confidence.
Yeah,
in
and
these
it's a very
regions.
mixed bag, obviously, Latin America. There's many different countries here. You know, Brazil picking up, I think, a little bit, and then some other countries actually down. So we really need to dive into the detail. And I would actually recommend the audience at the back of the slide deck that you can download. There's actually all the country results. You can also go to our website, and you can see all the country results and a further discussion in the report of the individual countries. Ilaria, the euro area. We talked already a little bit about it, Europe, but let's focus a bit on the euro area here. Overall, it doesn't look great, but it's interesting when you look at sort of the breakdown. So declines in job prospects, decline in balance in time to spend, but not much of a decline yet in terms of personal finance. Any thoughts around that?
Well, let's start with the simple number, which is 0, in the sense that in the euro area there was no change between Q3 and Q4. So consumer confidence is unchanged at 89. So that's the first. That's the first thing. But as I say, what we see is that we don't see a concern over personal finances really, but the job prospect variable is starting to look weaker, and that might affect the results of Q1 of 2020. Now, I think the interesting dynamic is to look inside some of the countries, because 3 of the largest the European euro area economies are actually seeing a minus this quarter. So I'm talking about Germany, which we already mentioned, but also Spain and Italy. And Italy in particular is interesting because it's home to the most pessimistic consumers of Europe. The absolute level of consumer confidence is 70, which is really low. So way more pessimistic consumers than optimistic ones in Italy. Perhaps rightly so, because economic growth is really weak and the political situation has been very tense for the past months, and especially this week with the elections in a key region that can put the government into discussion. So people know that, they hear the news, and I think this is perceived in the numbers as well. But also Spain, there was a decline in Spain, and that might be because of the combination of a weakening economy. Still, Spain is one of the fastest growing euro area countries in terms of GDP growth, but of course they also felt the slowdown as well, and this was in the middle of a political crisis as well, because there were 2 elections in 2019, and now there is a new government, but with a very weak majority in the parliament. So it's again might be a tense situation like Italy. The only large euro area country where there's been an increase this quarter is France, and probably because France is very much insulated by these trade tensions. In France, domestic demand is a bigger share of the economy compared to Germany and Italy, for example. But I'm not sure how long it's going to last, because the survey was taken just before the huge strike against the pension reform of Macron started, and I wonder whether that will have an impact in Q1. My bet, and I should not say this because this webcast is on the record, but my bet is that this will have an influence on the consumer confidence.
I'm really puzzled about these French results, right? Because it's true that the survey was taken in November and therefore slightly before the strikes really sort of started to heat up. But still, the concerns there must have been quite substantial, and I wonder why that is not reflected in the numbers. But it's interesting. We'll track that carefully. One non-Euro area country, actually, as of next week, one other non-EU country, being the UK. That's interesting. Consumers are actually pretty optimistic. It went up 3 points, so seems to be good stuff for the British consumer.
Well, I have a personal interpretation of that, and that's the fact that a lot of promises were made during the campaign for the elections, and the survey was taken just before the election, so at the peak of the promises. And now the difficult part is going to start because the government will have to deal with Brexit and the negative consequences of Brexit that all of a sudden will happen relatively fast. And so there I'm very cautious because I'm not sure we will see again a plus.
John has to wrap up this part. Good time to spend, right? If you look at that, right? So Europe down, Asia Pacific down, really large markets. US is up, that's good news. Some of the emerging markets are up. It seems that it is a very mixed picture around the world about spending.
It is, and I think this goes back to where you started on job prospects and the consumer spending here. Because if you look at just down these two columns on the red and the green, it's almost a perfect correlation. Where jobs are down, consumer spending is down, right? And where it's up, consumer spending is up. By the way, if you look at a country level, you see the same thing, right? So the U.S. last time we looked at this, people were a little worried about jobs, right? They weren't sure if the trade or anything was going to happen, was going to affect their jobs, and things went down. It's rebounded now, and by the way, consumption comes back. So it is, I think, very tightly correlated, and there may be a faster kind of, oh, I'm worried about my job, I'm going to cut down spending than we might have thought in the past. It happens fairly quickly.
Yeah. Okay, here is the recession chart. I was wondering where it was. So here it is. Elizabeth, if you look at this chart, this is actually now taking out a few countries, and then we're going to look at a little bit more concerns in a minute. U.S. consumers, we already discussed this, only 34% of them think that we're in a recession right now. We're not in a recession, but this what consumer sentiment of a recession is quite different.
I just want to know who these 35% of our population
going to ask them.
Who think that we're in a recession at this point in time. Who are these people?
Right. Well, even in the best times, you see that there are people in the economy who just don't think it is great. So people may be even in a personal recession or a local recession.
That's
right?
the point,
right.
And it goes back. It's how people are feeling. We're not polling economists in any of this. We're polling how people are feeling, and that's a really and that drives. And they don't do the economic analysis. It's just how am I feeling at this point in time, and that drives spending and everything else. And I think this chart really shows it because it doesn't necessarily align strictly with economic reality necessarily.
It might just be right. Not only their personal situation, but their friends in their local area, their region.
Exactly.
What do they see?
Great point.
I think the local area is critical. So if you go to the whole issue of inequality, I think there will be places in the United States where a lot of people think this is really a terrible place to be, and it is not. It's not a good environment. And there are other places that feel great. What is interesting though is that overall in the U.S. It's only 1/3 that really think that it is in a recession. Whereas Ilaria talked about Italy at the other end of the scale here, but there's some country in the middle, like France. 2/3 of consumers think the country is in recession, which I think is a striking number. Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to talk about Mexico. 72% of consumers think it's in recession.
Yes, I just wanted to add first though that globally this number of those that feel like they're in their recession is 2/3, over 2/3. So it's something that's universal, regardless of what economy, and the trend has been rising over the last several quarters, except for North America. And Latin America in general is one of the highest in terms of consumers who think they're in a recession. So you can see that represented by Mexico here. And also, some of the changes are interesting. We saw the largest change in recession fears over the third quarter in Asia-Pacific countries and the Euro area as a whole. And you can see here, Germany and France have, somewhat elevated concerns here, and that has been rising over time. Mexico has also seen really large increases over the last 3 quarters. So these trends are moving in a direction opposite of what you would think based on how economic performance has been in the last year or so. But it's something to watch. I mean, these fears definitely make consumers more cautious about the type of spending they're going to do in the future. So
yeah, whether or not
keep
we
our eye
think
on
they're
for
in
sure.
recession, if they think it's in recession, it's something we need to watch carefully. Ilaria, you want to comment on this?
Yes, well, I want to make a parallel between these results of the consumer confidence and the C-suite challenge results, because between September and October, we asked C-suite executives, including CEOs, what are your biggest concerns entering in 2020? And out of a list of about 17 or 18 items, what they picked as number one is the risk of recession. So we at Conference Board don't expect a recession in 2020 anytime soon, and we actually expect the economy to do better this year than last year. But this is in the mind of people, and it's in the mind of people on
Right,
both
and
sides.
the narrative, as we quite often say, the narrative, the story that we're telling, or that consumers are telling each other, or that business executives are telling each other, does matter. Okay, we're going to now go talk a little bit more about concerns. We didn't only talk about recession. So audience, be ready. There's a next poll question coming up here. And the poll question here is, I expect the following economic political concerns for consumers to increase the most across countries in 2020. So which of these concerns do you think are going to actually be most important will become more important for consumers to be concerned about? Is it job security? Is it the economy? Is it political stability? Is it debt? And this is mostly personal debt, I think, the way to interpret it. Is it increasing food prices or increasing utility bills? And we're going to ask you that. We're going to ask Elizabeth to briefly comment on that, and then we're going to ask you a second poll question on more personal concerns. So a little bit more time, give you sort of 5 more seconds to do this. What is the most important concern that will increase across countries in 2020? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Just changing almost last minute. Okay, so we got half of you actually saying political stability. And then pretty distant is actually the second is job security and personal debt. So it's really half of you who think that actually political stability will become more important as a concern. Elizabeth, what did our surveys think?
Well, yeah, that's a little bit different, I think, from these results here. I mean, basically, many of our consumers are primarily concerned with the economy and related to that, their job security. And as we were talking about with the recession question, consumers are concerned about the economy regardless of how well the economy is actually performing. If I actually don't see the slide, I don't know if we can go back to the slide deck.
Oh, yeah, team, if you can move the slide on to actually, yes, thank you. There it is.
Great, thank you so much. So you can see that, for example, the U.S. Still has a concern of about 23%, whereas Mexico, which is which is stagnating economically, the concern is about a third at 34%. So really, regardless, that concern for the economy is by and large the most important for consumers. And in terms of some of the other ones, political stability, we do see that's highest in the U.S. and the UK, which makes sense with some of the ongoing trade tensions and Brexit. In Latin America, it's a little bit lower than I would have thought, at about, with Mexico at 5% in general. For Latin America, it's about 7%. Debt is an interesting issue. It's really a rising concern, especially with interest rates being so low in many regions, especially in Europe. They're at all-time lows, and it's really encouraging consumers to borrow more, to spend more. And in Canada, for example, we see that's an issue. 21% of consumers are identifying. And there we have very high rates of consumer loans. We have rising delinquencies, so it's an issue there. Also in Russia, we have similar high rates of consumer debt. And in terms of increasing prices for food and utility bills, that is also quite high in some of our markets, which is always puzzling to me because inflation rates are rather low, but it seems that when it comes to trying to save money, consumers look to these categories of food and utilities to try to pinch.
Yeah, I think that really shows
bit.
that there are specific categories that still can have quite an impact, like in Canada, food prices, or look at Russia, for example, and where inflation actually is up quite a bit. So some of these results do actually make sense. Now, before I open this up for some further discussion, let's go to the next poll question. It's a similar question. It's now not asking about economic and political concerns. It's about more social and personal concerns. So I expect the following social personal concerns for consumers to increase the most across countries in 2020. It's going to be health, work-life balance, global warming, immigration, and crime. Just for the sake of transparency, we actually asked a longer list, but we basically picked the ones that actually pop up highest according to the respondents. But we'd like to see what you think, and then Elizabeth will again review the overall results, and then we'll open this up a little bit for discussion. Okay, 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, global warming by far the largest. I have to say that the number of responses is relatively limited here, but still there's a clear emphasis here on the importance of global warming. So let's look at the results that we get from the survey. We'll close the poll and look at the results from the survey, and Elizabeth, take us through those results.
Yes, and it seems that our consumers are also very alarmed about global warming as well, and actually for the global index as a whole, or globally, it did reach a record high as one of the biggest concerns, not only globally, but also in Asia Pacific in the fourth quarter of 2019. And in general, it's also one among the highest concerns in Euro area. So you see those elevated figures for France and Germany. So that's very much in line. In Japan, it's a growing trend as well, 20%. That has been accelerating very rapidly in the last couple of quarters in that market. Immigration seems to be not as a high concern. It is in Euro area, but in Asia Pacific, it's basically a non-issue. Crime is a large issue, primarily in Latin America. You can see that in Mexico, which had a record high violence levels in 2019, and you also hear of other crime throughout the region in general. Health has also been reached its a record high as one of the biggest concern globally, as well as in Europe and Africa and the Middle East in the fourth quarter of 2019. And work-life balance seems to be one of the biggest issues in Asia.
China, 34%. Very interesting. Steve, what are you picking up here from these concerns that's interesting?
Yeah, so a few insights that I would derive from this. First of all, global warming is a very interesting one because it's the countries that are most responsible for carbon emissions and pollution and man-made contribution to global warming are the ones that ranked it the lowest. And the ones that have seemed to have addressed this the most rank it the highest. So there's an inverse thing there.
Well, but you could say that there's more attention for the issue in those countries.
There's more attention, they've addressed it, but we're not going to solve the issue unless the countries who ranked it the lowest address the issues, and that's big. A couple other things that come out of it, the immigration issue was much higher when we had all the migrant situation going on. It's amazing how fast these things turn. Third insight is, overall, you could argue that these are relatively low numbers. I mean, that in fact, when you start asking people, what are all your worries in the world, these are high-class problems, let's put it that way, and that's a good thing. Final thing I'd say on health is that it's interesting that in the oldest societies where aging is a concern, the health issues are the highest. And in fact, in the youngest societies, it's not. And this is, it's very highly correlated.
Japan, Russia,
and the U.S.
China even.
So you see that as the baby boomers age in these older economies, that becomes a bigger issue and the biggest cost, which does have an economic impact.
And also in some countries like China, for example, there's just lack of healthcare insurance for older people, and facilities and things like that play a role. John, what are you picking up from here?
Well, just to build on, I wonder if some of the health in China concerns actually relate less to global warming, but to pollution.
The pollution,
right? The pollution's going on in Beijing.
Yeah, they're wearing masks and
it brings it real to you
does.
when you have to do that.
Yeah, good point. Ilaria, any comments before we move on?
A couple of things, perhaps. One is on, if I look at Europe and at these numbers for European countries, there are two groups that stand out to me. One is the Club Med countries. So if I look at Italy, Spain, and Greece, I can really see that job security ranks number one or at most number two maximum. So really jobs, and in fact, this is the countries where the unemployment rate is highest in Europe. And then there is another element that stands out, and that's the concern over health. And that's not an average, a high number for Europe, but it ranks really high in some Central and Eastern European countries, and we see that in the table here in Russia as well. So different countries, different concerns, and then I'm actually quite amazed by the work-life balance in China because it's basically 1 in 3 people that consider work-life balance, I guess, the lack of work-life balance in this case, as the top 1 or top 2 concern. So it's actually quite an impressive number.
Yeah, and that's actually true of some of the other Southeast Asian countries too. The same thing, you see work-life balance.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to see how these issues are popping up here and how they actually, make a lot of sense in terms of interpreting them.
But this is what I'm saying. This poll has changed. When people, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, they're not worried about starvation. They're not worried about where their survival and so forth. And so it becomes high-class problems. And I mean that in a positive sense, that they're now worried about balance in work life rather than where's my job or how am I going to feed my family. So if again, I'm the half glass full insight here is we're really dealing with a different class of problems.
Yeah, and you get more middle classes in these countries. These countries become more advanced, and then these issues begin to play a much more important role. We're sort of approaching, there's a lot of good stuff to talk about. Let's talk a little bit about spending. And John, let's first talk about not spending. So this chart is really about decisions of people to actually change their spending and to save on household expenses. What do you identify in this chart?
So we'd ask people if they, in the past year, have changed their spending to try to save more, right? And you see the numbers here going from Germany at a little over 30%, all the way to Mexico on the other side up to 70 and 80. I think, so one is just to reflect on those differences, but to me, what we also look for are the trends. Are these numbers going up? And so are consumers now more likely to be affecting their behavior and their spending behavior given their situation, right? And that's where you see Mexico, Japan, and Russia are particularly, well, not Russia, but the other two are up 4 and 8 points. Is quite a substantial increase in these two countries. China, because it's so big, even up 2 points is actually big. This will be a number we'll continue to watch as we move forward to see if they're really going to be changing their spending behaviors.
Yeah. And then this chart, I mean, this is a little bit of a teaser for what our consumer dynamics colleagues will do when they're going to take a much more of a deep dive. We just want to have a little bit of a feel for this on how to interpret then, once you have covered your living expenses, which of the following statements best describe what you do if you spare cash, what you spend it on.
And just very quickly, here's what I do when I look at a chart like this, because you've got a bunch of different categories here. You have spending categories like the first 5 columns, out of home, entertainment, new clothes, new tech products, et cetera, and over the holidays. Then you have the 3 columns on the other side, which gets all paying off debt, putting in savings, or I have no spare cash unfortunately to spend. And we look at these numbers and how these are trending. The spending numbers in particular, you see very high for China and Japan, which I think reflects their higher saving rates. So we see some of that, and very relatively lower numbers in Germany, and Russia. So that's one thing we look at just to see how the saving things goes. The other thing then is to say, okay, well, what categories are affected, right? And we look at the 5 categories on the other side. By the way, we ask about a whole bunch more, where people might start, cutting back. We actually ask another question on where are you going to cut back? And by the way, these are the categories that come up, with one exception of cheaper brands of groceries, which I think gets at the essential living things. But so for example, if you look at, say the U.S., the biggest numbers there are, in holidays and vacations at 32, and new clothes. Apparel is one of these things that tends to be one of the higher sectors across many, many countries, and so they would be particularly maybe the first to feel some of the brunt of this.
Steve, as a former CEO in the retail business, when you look at a chart like this, numbers are a little bit all over the map, really, is sort of my interpretation. And you look at this and you think, I can do anything with this. It's hard for me to have. Or do you say there's interesting stuff in here that helps me think things through?
Oh, I think it's very. Look at the last column.
Right.
Look at how few people have no spare cash. And roll the time clock back to a decade ago in the financial crisis. These numbers were very high, where people didn't think they had any spare cash at all. Look at China. Only 3% of the respondents in China said they had no spare cash. At what point do we stop calling China a developing economy? They're the second largest in the world, and nobody is short of cash in China. Declared, and they're going to spend on all this.
Spending on out-of-home entertainment and new clothes and new tech products.
If I'm a retailer, you're going to spend like drunken sailors. Is the way I read this, and I'm really happy with this. Look, I think, but I would look at the previous chart and say you've got 50% of the consumers in the United States saying that they are going to save. Yeah, right. I'll believe it when I see it. Consumer debt is rising. We're spending more. Consumers are spending more than they're taking in. So, this is a lot of the spending is being fueled by debt, and they're not acknowledging it here. They think they're saving.
Right.
I don't know where it's going.
Right. That's also, how do the consumers exactly think about what saving is?
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a good one. Ilaria, any views from you on these charts?
No, I'm amazed by clothes. Because I noticed that when you ask people if you have more money, what do you spend it on, clothes comes out quite regularly, but then also when you have to save money, what would you cut, and then clothes comes back. So there are some items that are peculiar in that sense.
You need to go out there and shop a little bit more. Elizabeth, let's wrap this up. Any final interpretations on your side?
Just one last comment on savings. Again, just surprising, especially with interest rates being so low that anybody is really saving anything, and if they are, they're keeping it in their couch cushions because there's no incentive to do that at banks in many of these countries. So that's surprising to me.
So if I wrap this up, it seems to me like where we started, and it doesn't feel to me like the discussion changed it much. Consumers very optimistic overall, not everywhere, but overall pretty optimistic. But there's some sideways movement. There's a little bit more concern down the road. Steve, you said it's as good as it gets. Is that sort of the general feel you would have?
If you look at the context of the stock market, when you're nearing highs, everybody starts talking about when's it going to go down. They start shorting the market, so forth. This is the consumer's way of saying, this is great, we're good, we're just worried, as to when it's going to stop.
Does it mean that, if you're in the consumer products business, you should begin to plan a little bit for times to come that are not as good?
It doesn't look like 2020 is going to be the year that you have to worry about it.
Okay, you would agree?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, would agree with that. Ilaria, in Europe, for retailers and producers of consumer goods, no time yet to worry?
I don't know. I am not 100% sure, but I'm a European, so on average, I'm not.
You are not. So our final optimist then, Elizabeth. Do you think this is as good as it gets?
The labor market has surprised me time and time again. So taking the more optimistic viewpoint, I think there still is more room in the market.
Very good. Some good comments here also in the chat box. Circular economies need to be implemented. Short-term spending can result in long-term debt. Think before you spend. That's always a good idea. That's actually a good one to end on. Think before you spend. I like that. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, great conversation. There's some additional resources here, including country results that you can look at. You can download this slide deck. Thank you very much for joining. And then the next report on Q2 will be available, let me think. This chart is probably not quite up to date. Should be available in
3 months.
In 3 months, so that should be in mid-April. Elizabeth, I don't know if you have the exact date, but it should be mid-April. April, you get the Q1 results. Please, some other resources here to look at, and join us for any of our other webcasts here at the conference board, whether it's our Economy Watch, whether it is our special webcast on labor markets, and everything else that Economy Strategy and Finance Center and our other centers at the conference board are producing. Thanks to the panel. Hope you enjoyed this webcast. Wish you all a good day and hope to see you again soon. My name is Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the conference.